Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning, the Citizens Club of Springfield Monthly Policy Breakfast. Special acknowledgement this morning, our coffee sponsor, WMAY. And I want to also acknowledge that WMAY is a kind of a media partner with us, and we'll be working together on different ideas. And we thank them, and we're honored that we can work with them. A couple of announcements. On June 13th, which is a Wednesday evening, Jim Clifton, who is the chair and CEO of Gallup, will be in Springfield for an evening forum basically on job creation. Jim wrote a book called The Coming Jobs War. Many of you have read it. We've forced it on you in some cases, I think. We thank the State Journal Register. This is actually a partnership between us and the SJR. They are running excerpts of the book, have run 2 weekends of excerpts, another one tomorrow, and at least 2 more after that. The program is Wednesday evening, June 13th, 7 o'clock to 8:30 in Theater 3 here in the Hoagland Center. There'll be a panel of Mayor Langfelder, County Board Chair Andy Van Meter, and Bruce Summer, who's with the Entrepreneurship Institute at UIS and with Innovate Springfield. And it'll be quite, I think, quite a show. And Clifton is big time in the world, really. And he's flying into here out of New York and spending a very short period of time with us, but he's agreed to do that. And I think it'll be kind of a very special occasion. Our next policy breakfast is June 22nd. It's our annual meeting. Program that day will be basically on sewers, storm drainage, and water reclamation. And we will have Greg Humphrey, who is the Executive Director of the Sangamon County Water Reclamation District, and Mark Mahoney, who is Director of Public Works for the City of Springfield. That also should be quite a interesting program. I am very pleased today that we have back, after an absence, I don't remember the last time, Rick Harnisch is the Executive Director of the Midwest High-Speed Railroad Association, located in Chicago. He has been with us before. As I said in the notice I sent out, real high-speed rail through the middle of Illinois would totally reform Illinois in my mind, and God, we need that. And so I'd like to introduce Mr. Rick Harnisch.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you all for coming on this morning and for having me down here. I think it's been about 10 years since the last time that I presented, so I'm really happy to be back. I have been at this job for about 18 years now as a full-time staff member. We gathered together as a small group in Chicago in 1991, started meeting, and in 1993 we founded the organization. And our founding purpose is that if Spain, which at that time was the 3rd country to open high-speed rail, can do the distance of Chicago to St. Louis in 2 hours and 20 minutes, then we should be able to do that here in Illinois. And we've been working steadily on that since then. I started getting involved in this because I saw the difference that happens in communities when people come into the community on foot. And because they're on foot, have more interactions with people because you bump into people on the sidewalk. You can have more efficient small local businesses that are really part of the community. And there's just a lot more vibrancy, and it's more efficient to provide services to these sorts of towns. And trains are the catalyst for making that vibrant downtown area really happen and really shine. And I saw that as a kid in Cleveland. When we would take the train to downtown Cleveland, you'd get off, go to the Walgreens, there actually I think at that time was a Woolworths, in the downtown department stores, and all the people in the hubbub. And as the trains went downhill, so did the downtown. And there were a lot of other reasons for that, but there's that connection. So we have the opportunity in Illinois to really use that tool to reinvigorate the economy of Illinois and set ourselves apart from our neighbors. And we really do need to find a way to be very different than our neighbors, that's different than some of the challenges that you're all very aware of that we have over in the Capitol building. And this is the tool that can make the difference. So this picture I actually took this past October. I went to a conference 3 days where they discussed the impact of high-speed rail on local communities in a town called Ciudad Real. It's a university town like Champaign or Normal. It's about the same distance from Madrid as Champaign and Normal are. And the interesting thing was about a third of the attendees of this conference stayed in Madrid hotels, and they would take the train down every morning. And this is taking the train back at the end of the conference with some of the other people that were there at the conference. This was to celebrate the 25th anniversary of this high-speed line in Spain. So we need to start, though, with where we're at and where we've been and really celebrate the progress that we've had. And this is the new station in Dwight. It opened a couple of years ago. I took this picture several weeks ago. We've got a new locomotive in the background, which I had the pleasure. I did a round-trip train ride down here last Wednesday. And these things really, you can notice the difference in the way they accelerate out of the stations. They're much quieter. And I don't know if you've ever taken the train to Chicago and you have to walk by the locomotive and you have to hold your ears and you've got the stink of the exhaust coming out. These don't have that because they're Tier 4 environmental standards, and they're also much quieter, which means they're quieter going through the small town communities. But when I started doing this and started making these round trips back in 2001, 2002, the track was in really bad shape, so the ride was really rough. There were a lot of areas where you had to slow down because the tracks were bad. The signals would go out in the rain, so you would have to just go 20 miles an hour because the signals went out in the rain. The stations were a mess. And because we put together a plan as a state to rebuild this line and make it a high-quality line, we were ready when there was a unique opportunity to get those funds in order to rebuild the line. And so now we're getting the benefits of that. And that train I took, both of them in both directions, were pretty full with a lot of folks that clearly were down here just for the day, for lobbying, but also a mix of lobbyists and a lot of other folks. So we've set the stage for something really cool. And that's what I want to talk to you today about, is what is that really cool and how do we get there? And to do that, we have to do something we haven't done since we built the interstate highway system. We need to build basically a new highway for trains. And this is that outside of Ciudad Real. And again, downtown Ciudad Real is really vibrant. Lots of stores downtown. There's a square where people interact, but you can also walk out to the country. And so in the process of building high-speed rail, they also moved the conventional rail line out of the downtown and over to the outside of town. So you've got on the left-hand side there where the freight trains run and the slower Amtrak trains on the left-hand side, and on the right side you've got the two high-speed tracks. Now, this is an older line. As I said, it's 25 years old, so it's not going the fastest that lines do today that are built. It's only going 186 miles an hour on these tracks. But in order to do that, there's a couple of things you need to do. The first is, I talked about the separate freight track. The second is you can't have any highway grade crossings. In this country, the regulation says maximum 110 miles an hour across a grade crossing. And that's why the state is shooting for 110 on the existing Amtrak service. So this is one of the biggest challenges, is how do we overcome and help the folks who will be impacted by this have reduced impacts. The other is to go faster than 125, you have to electrify the tracks in order to have the train light enough to go that fast. And then you need safety fencing, and we've already done that on the 110 line, which is very, very exciting. So what we're talking about is taking these two things, and it's been framed for years about it's one or the other. And Japan is really the only country that's really done a one or the other. And in fact, they've made some compromises here and there where high-speed trains go on old track. But in most countries, what happens is, just like we did with the interstate highway system, you pull out of, in my case, an alley, which is really potted and bump holed, right? And then you go out on a local street and then a busier street, and then you get on the high-speed highway that has no grade crossings. It's completely separate from everything else, and you can go really fast. That's what we need to do here in Illinois, where we build sections of high-speed line and the trains go on both tracks. So we're talking about combining those two to create a really powerful system throughout the entire state. So the colors don't show up very well here, I apologize, but the purple is what we envision as this high-speed trunk where trains are going 200 miles an hour at least. And right now today they're designing for 250 miles an hour when they build new track. It appears right now the economic breakpoint is about 205 miles an hour in terms of that's where it makes sense to run trains. But we envision this new trunk that stretches from O'Hare down to East St. Louis and is built in phases. We don't know where the different phases are, but it probably doesn't get built all at once. A lot of upgrades to the existing Amtrak lines in order to feed passengers and trains into those tracks. So in the Carbondale example, you would get on a train in Carbondale. It would be a high-speed train, but it would only go 90 miles an hour until it gets to Champaign. It would get on the high-speed tracks and go 200 miles an hour. They do this all over the world. We've got a little bit of technical hurdles we have to get over to make it happen, but it's doable. And then buses connecting into that to feed in from the smaller towns. And we don't have Taylorville on here, but I can imagine that some sort of bus connection down there really makes sense. So that's the big picture of what we would like to see happen. And what is the goal for this for Springfield? We know that 90 minutes is possible from downtown Springfield to downtown Chicago into Union Station. We've had 3 studies show that that is possible. So we've said, well, we're willing to compromise a little bit. We'll just say the target is 2 hours, right? But imagine how that changes your downtown if somebody can go up for just a lunch or come down here just to see the Lincoln exhibits or to say, oh my gosh, I need to meet with that doctor over at SIU or whatever it is, and just say at the last minute, I'm going to go down there and back. You can't do that with a car really, and you definitely can't do it with a plane, but with a high-speed train you can do that. And it creates a level of flexibility that just doesn't exist with other modes. But beyond that, we think you should be able to take the train directly to O'Hare. And what happens at O'Hare? O'Hare is unique in this country, where you can get anywhere in the world. So again, think about that person in Tokyo who would really like to come to Springfield and either maybe invest here or have some interactions with the university or present to the government or something. How much more likely they are to make that trip here to Springfield if they can fly from Tokyo, make a connection to a train that runs every hour and is on time and is not the train that gets canceled because United doesn't want to fly the plane that day because there's weather and they need to fly the big jet and not the little jet to Springfield. But that train runs no matter what the weather is, and it runs every hour. Think about what that does to this area if that could happen. It's also the point at which somebody, if they wanted to come from Schaumburg to Springfield, they would drive and park in the parking garage that's there and come down here on the train. And the goal for this, and the reason we do this, is because those personal connections are so important. You can interact over the internet, but a lot is lost. And so if you can meet together face to face, or come see a thing face to face, it's so much more valuable, and trains allow you to do that. And not only that, they allow you to do it while you're traveling, which is less easy in a car and certainly much less harder on an airplane. But if you look, I don't know if you can see the detail, but these guys in the corner there are having a lot of fun having a conversation about something. Not sure what. But the last time I gave this presentation, somebody in the audience spoke up and said, "How fast are you going?" Well, we're going 186 miles an hour. And he said, "Look at that bottle of water. It's not moving," right? So you can stand and have a conversation. You can sit. You can work at a table. On some high-speed trains, you can get dinner. A whole bunch of stuff that just makes the travel experience a lot more enjoyable. So what does this mean for price, though? And our opponents, depending upon who their audience is this train is for poor people and you don't want to ride the train with those poor people, right? Sometimes they say, this train is just for the rich, right? And it's interesting how they can have these two arguments at the same time, but actually it's for both. So a high-speed train, the expense is in the tracks, right? But the actual operating of the train is less expensive than operating an Amtrak train, dramatically less expensive. Because today, an Amtrak crew can go from Chicago to St. Louis in one day. With a high-speed train, they can make that round trip twice. So you get 4 times the productivity out of the crew. There's a bunch of other things that happen as well. So we imagine that the cheapest seats would be about the same price as an Amtrak ticket today, $23 on the low end. And I base this on Florence to Milan, which takes about 90 minutes to 2 hours, and it's the same distance. The lowest fare for a week out was $23. The highest fare over here on the other end is $123. So if you really want to just sit with the rich people, you can do that at the other end of the train, right? And then there's a middle class in the middle. So over there on your right is the price of gas. In the middle is the price you pay if you're charging your company the IRS mileage rate in your own car. And over here is about half of a limo to Chicago, and with a varying level of service. So that means that you're attracting a whole broad range of people into your downtown. Some high-speed trains, as I said, have restaurants where you can sit down and have a meal. They're incredibly productive. Most of them, except the ones in Japan and China, have a cafe car. When we talk, you can go stand and you get a drink. So when Spain opened their first high-speed line, they were very similar to us, 5 trains a day, about the same amount of time that it takes us today between Chicago and St. Louis. And the trains really weren't on time very often. So not surprisingly, most people drove, and there was a high level of people taking the bus there. A little bit higher than, we don't really know, unfortunately, where people, but we think that this is pretty close with a little bit less on flying. So 2 years after the high-speed line opened, 1 full year of operation, that would flipped. So now the majority of people are taking the train. Flying has kind of gone away. Still a lot of driving, of course, and people are still taking the old slow trains and the buses. But here's what happened. The overall travel market increased 30%. So not only did you make travel easier and less expensive for the people who are already traveling, you made it possible for people to travel more often. And an example of this is one day I was in Madrid with a tour group, and we had some things planned in Madrid. And one of our groups said, I really want to see that castle down in Seville. And we held a vote, and we said, well, we'll go to Seville and back for the day, right? Imagine if there's a group of Chinese tourists, and they said, you know what, we're going to go down to Springfield for the day. So high-speed rail is proven. There's thousands of miles of high-speed line constructed all around the world. Hyperloop, which you hear a lot about, doesn't exist yet. We don't know whether it will work. We don't know whether you will enjoy riding on it. We don't know how many people it will carry per hour. But one of the things that they say is an advantage is it's going to be up in the air, so you're not impacting farms as much, right? Well, that's taking a disadvantage and turning into an advantage, because high-speed trains can go on the ground if you want. They can also go up in the air. And China actually, because they were thinking long-term, they built most of their high-speed lines actually on viaducts or tunnels. Very little of it is actually on the ground. So they invested big now in order to have a high-quality service for a long time. And they did it in a big way. So this map is a little out of date. The solid purple is where high-speed trains are running today at 125 miles an hour above. Most of it's at 200 miles an hour. There's a line along the lake where we took the Japan system and stretched it out a little bit to show how long it is. And you'll see it goes from Orlando up to Boston. And remember how Japan is small and how high-speed rail works in Japan because it's so much smaller than the U.S., right? And yet, look, they've already built a high-speed line that stretches our whole East Coast. So down there at New Orleans is Guangzhou, right across the border of Hong Kong, and they are about to open the connection into Hong Kong. Up at the top by the end is Beijing. You can do a high-speed train if you want, 8 hours. They can move a division with their personal armor and weapons from Beijing to Hong Kong in 1 day. We couldn't come close to that. They can also get them out to the western frontier as well in 2 days. Over there towards Columbus is New York. They do Chicago to New York, I'm sorry, not New York, Shanghai. They do Beijing to Shanghai, Chicago to New York in 4 hours, and they're working to get that down under 4 hours. The fastest you can do downtown Chicago to downtown New York right now is 5, if you include the taxi ride, security, and all of that. So we're way behind, obviously. And I talked about how we don't need to do this all at once, right? We need to do pieces, just like we did the interstate highway system. And this is an example of that in France, where they took an old right-of-way that had abandoned tracks on it to get out of Paris, and they upgraded that, and they put a berm above it, put it in a trench so that they created a new park for the community. They built a new high-speed line from the outskirts of Paris to the outskirts of Tours with a little branch off. And then those blue lines are everywhere that the high-speed trains go. So they're only going really fast up until recently in the red section up that first like 100 miles. But last year they opened up another section which gets you all the way down to Bordeaux and out to, out to the east. But still you've got these high-speed trains serving all those places. And that's what we need to do here, is look at where this funnel is in order to serve a broad swath of the state, and actually beyond in order to make this work, with one section of about 100 miles of high-speed line. And here's the European system overlaid over the US. So Chicago is Paris in this map. Up there where the blue or the purple turns into blue up in Wisconsin, that's London. And they've already started construction on HS2, which extends that line up to Birmingham. That's up by Duluth. Down here by Dallas is Madrid. Over on the coast, down in North Carolina, is Milan, and Naples is out in the ocean, right? So again, remember, Europe is smaller than the US, so they can do high-speed rail because they're so much more closer together, right? It's baloney. We're just as well populated as they are, except our Great West, they call Siberia, right? I don't know if you can see, there's a little dashed blue line out in the ocean. When we did the map, Morocco's high-speed line was just in the talking stages. It'll open this year. There's a map, there's a line that starts that goes off the map. I rode the Turkish high-speed rail system last week, 2 weeks ago. They've had high-speed rail for a couple of years, and they just started construction on another line that will take them over to the Iraqi border. So again, we're way behind of this. And because we're behind, we are paying much more in transportation expenses than we need to be. And you're paying the hidden cost of providing all of this parking so that your visitors have a place to store their cars is really a drain on your municipal budget that you don't see. But if you could bring those people here by car, you could take that land and turn it into a productive real estate tax generating spot that helps the local finances. And that's what they're doing all around the world. So we've made some initial steps towards this. We did an initial study in 2011 that was donated in part by Siemens to us that gave us the hour and 20 minutes Springfield to Chicago. We know that that's reasonable because of that. And then Governor Quinn funded a study that took a next step and tried to get more details from ours. And they came to very similar conclusions about the cost. And when you're in this pre-thing, being off by, 10 or 20% is you're right in that ballpark. So we know about how much it costs. The ridership, U of I was more optimistic about ridership than we were. And they actually said that they think they were low on ridership. And they all demonstrated that this would generate an operating surplus. And U of I said probably between 5% and 20% of the infrastructure cost with their ridership analysis would be financeable out of the fare box. Now, one thing that is kind of hidden in our history is if you'll notice a lot of our U.S. highways run right along the side, the right-of-way for railroads. I haven't been able to prove this, but a guy he says he read this in a book, right? A lot of those U.S. highways, the local match was provided by revenue bonds. And who pays a revenue bond? The next adjoining landowner. And if you put the highway right next to the railroad, guess who the landowner is, right? So we jump-started this system of the highway system with other things. And then when it got to 1956, and we said we're going to do a 4-lane highway connecting every congressional district in the nation, and we're going to raise gas taxes 10 cents to do it in 1956, it was because there was already this base that started from something else. Our challenge is we don't have that base of base revenue. We have to jumpstart it some other way. And that's what we want to find out, is how do you figure out how to phase this, put as much traffic over those initial segments so that you can get as much of it actually financed with a PPP. But this map doesn't tell the story. We need to go back to that bigger map where you consider the feeders in order to drive a lot more traffic. And I'm sorry I skipped a step. This is the ridership analysis that U of I did. So up at the top in 2014, that was the combination of everybody riding Chicago to St. Louis, Chicago to Indianapolis, and Chicago to Carbondale on the top. The next blue line down is what they're projecting for when this first round of improvements is done to the Amtrak line. And then you've got high and low estimates for ridership on Chicago to Indianapolis and Chicago to St. Louis if you had high-speed rail. So most people, you think about your trip, beginning to end. That's reasonable. Planners tend to think about segments where there might be some stops in the middle, but it's still beginning to end. And you heard the Amtrak president frustrated me so much. He says we need to focus on 100 to 300 mile city pairs, which is the wrong way of thinking about it, and I'm going to show you in a minute. So if you only look at these two cities, then you've only got one opportunity to use this infrastructure. And so this is that initial segment of high-speed line that I was talking about. We need to figure out where to put it. If you can look beyond that, right now in this case that we've got here, every one of these links, somebody is proposing adding a service there. But they're only looking at Indianapolis to Muncie, and Indianapolis to Muncie doesn't work on its own. A high-speed line from Chicago to Indianapolis probably works, but it's kind of tough. Indianapolis to Cincinnati, again, doesn't work on its own. But they all look at them individually, and we do this everywhere, whether it's with bus lines in your transit network or whatever. But what happens if you think about all the places now, if you built all of this, that people could go from Louisville or Milwaukee or Cincinnati or Bloomington, Rockford, and Muncie, right? Now people have a much greater opportunity to ride those trains on each of those segments, which means that each segment is much more viable. So in your case here, that means people are coming here to St. Louis, which means they're more likely to take a transit bus, which means your cost per person in operating those transit buses goes down because you are adding people to existing buses, right? We need to think about this holistically in order to get to the point where it works. And in this case, a lot of these segments in the U.S. will be buses, and California has already led the way with that in providing a strong network of buses. You can get anywhere in the state by a combination of train and bus. Doesn't always quite work because the trains aren't quite fast enough and they're not quite frequent enough, but in terms of coverage, you can get there. So they've got something to build on, and we do too because of our Amtrak service. So we hear a lot about California high-speed rail. And the messaging has been very difficult because California High-Speed Rail Authority is in charge of building tracks. That's all they're in charge of, and picking somebody to run them. So they can't talk about anything beyond that because their job is to build those tracks and find somebody to run them. And the other thing is the way the environmental clearance process works, you can only talk about what you have, what you're working on. You can't talk about that network. Right? So this green section in the middle is where they have funding to build tracks, and it's under construction today. And people say, well, that's a train to nowhere. But they can't look at how traffic's going to funnel into that because they are not charged with that. And so it makes it very difficult for them to message how this is going to impact the entire state. And then they, unfortunately for them, in Bakersfield is the guy McCarthy, who's probably in line to be Speaker of the House next year. And at the other end, you've got the head of the Railroad Committee, and they're part of the effort to kill high-speed rail nationwide, and they happen to be at each end of their high-speed line. So that makes it very challenging. The other issue in California, which we don't have, is you've got really serious mountain ranges. So you have to build in the middle and figure out how to get across the mountain ranges, which is harder for them to do it. But the state is figuring this out. And they just came out with a plan, a long-term plan that looks at how this stuff all interconnects. And they studied what happens if you coordinate all these services. So everything on this map is planned by somebody. And they're saying, well, we're going to figure out how to coordinate this. So if you get off a train in Bakersfield, you've got buses sitting there to take you to 4 different places, right? Or all of these different, and how you phase this step by step. This is what we want Illinois to do. And what they think, so up on top, that's every county in California. And that's the ridership by train or connecting bus from county to county on the top. And it's actually not, because in order to make this graph work on the lower sides, Fresno doesn't even show up on this graph on the top, even though Fresno is a station that's about as busy as the Springfield station, right? If they keep going the way they're going, with each agency looking at different pieces of the puzzle, they project in 2040 they'll have this kind of ridership. But if they coordinate it and figure out how to make it work as a system with a single fare card, that's what they think happens. And so now they have transformed the ability of people to get around the state, and to Las Vegas, by the way, tremendously. They have set the stage for them to make the entire state part of both the Bay and the LA Basin. And so everybody shares in the wealth of those two places. And again, we could do that with high-speed rail. So what we're saying is we start today, we have the state look at a big plan, and we step it back to what can we do now. And I would say in the next year or two, what we really need to figure out how to do is get a train that gets you to Chicago before 9 o'clock, and also a train that leaves here at 3, and add it to the existing service. I think your ridership would go up tremendously if we could make that happen. So that's the 2 to 3 year goal. But let's start figuring out how this works into a big plan, and how we are going to build infrastructure now so that when this stuff comes, it all works together and it's easy to do. So we put this together, and we call it as a package called the Illinois Fast Track Initiative. We are seeking to raise some funds in order to make this case in specifically the Illinois case and how we get Rockford into it so that you could take the train from Rockford to Springfield, and how we actually make this work, and more importantly, how we finance it going forward, so that we can start to build much stronger connections throughout the entire state, not only to Chicago, but to Jacksonville, to Quincy, to Carbondale, to St. Louis, to Champaign. And I forgot to mention, in Spain they have, I talked in the diagram, those prices for the long distance train, the high speed train going to Chicago. But in Spain and Japan, they run a lower class service that makes lots of little stops. And so like in Japan, the really, really fast trains go every 5 to 10 minutes. And once an hour, they have a train that makes a stop every 20 miles, right? And those trains are used for people to take daily work trips. So your labor shed here really goes out to probably Peoria and Champaign. I know people who live in Champaign and work here. And I know people who live here and work in Champaign, right? Imagine if instead you could have a commuter train that runs once an hour and has a low fare and doesn't have those nice amenities, but it makes it possible for people to share work and jobs. And so you could really put down roots here. And then if you need to get a job for a while in a different city, you can do that, but your roots are here and vice versa. And I think that makes us much stronger. And things like ADM moving its headquarters to Chicago. You know, I'm a resident of Chicago. I have to be very happy about how aggressive my mayor is about getting companies, right? On the other hand, I don't think it's good for the health of the state that the headquarters of ADM moved to Chicago, or the headquarters of Caterpillar is not in Peoria. With high-speed rail, those people wouldn't have had to have moved. To sum up, trains make it possible to be there in person. And there are lots of things that just don't work as well over the internet that work much better in person. So thank you for your attention, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Hello. My name is Zach Roth. I think we've talked over the phone before.
Probably, yes.
Yeah, we did. I'm writing on behalf of the Springfield Business Journal again. Just one thing. You did mention the political machinations of the California plan, the potential new Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. How could the upcoming midterm elections affect the future of high-speed rail, not just here in Illinois, but across the country?
I don't know how that affects it. You know, for some reason, this was a fairly bipartisan issue until a certain president took it on as his issue, and then suddenly it became less of a bipartisan issue. I know I want to introduce my legislative consultant, Dave Winters. He was a Republican from Rockford who led the effort to get the money to rebuild your line out here because the commitment was we would extend service to Rockford once this line was done. So the places that are having the most challenges are in Republican districts in terms of economic challenges. And the ones who really need to have better connections. So this really should be a bipartisan issue. And hopefully as we get farther away from that more controversial president, then it becomes less of an issue as we move forward.
Thank you. What's the status of the current high-speed, or I guess it really is mid-speed rail from Chicago to St. Louis? That part of it flows through Springfield, either on 3rd Street or maybe goes to 10th Street at some point. And then a second question is there a difference in the approach to the current Trump administration than the prior administration?
Yes. So in terms of the existing service, again, this was an incredibly valuable project. So what the state did through Union Pacific was completely rebuilt the railroad from the foundation up, and has made this an asset for the state that will last for a century. That's exciting in terms of the future of our state. And they brought it all up to very modern standards. It's much safer. Most of the grade crossing work is done. The track work is mostly done. There's a new bridge over the Kankakee River that when I was working on this back in the late 2000s, it seemed crazy to talk about a new bridge across the Kankakee. I rode across it yesterday. The new locomotives are out there running, and they're already showing improvement. One challenge was that Nippon Sharyo got the award to build the coaches, and unfortunately they were unable to perform. And fortunately, the state was able to work out a deal where Siemens would build the coaches. And I actually think they're going to be a much better design than what the state originally, it wasn't the state. The state wanted what we're getting. Some other folks in California pushed us for the design that Nippon Sharyo was going to provide. So we're going to get much better trains. Those will probably be coming online in the next year or so. I'm sorry, I said that wrong, 2 years. So you've got new locomotives, you've got better signaling, you've got fences, you've got better grade crossings, better track, better bridges. The last piece is actually the signaling system that allows you to go faster than 80 miles an hour. And there are signaling systems off the shelf all around the world that allow you to go faster than 80 miles an hour. The problem is that Congress passed a law in 2008 that said and I'm simplifying it, every locomotive in the country has to be able to operate on any piece of track anywhere in the country. It's called interoperability. And so the freight railroads really drove the discussion about what kind of signaling you're going to have out here. And they didn't want off the shelf. They wanted something that was still kind of theoretical. So they're in the process of installing that. The UP is saying they should have that work done this year, and that allows the speeds to go up. They're at this point, and we'll get to the question about the administrations, right? So the previous administration was very aggressive about how are we going to make this work. And one of the things we need to do is figure out how to operate European trains here instead of trains built to our safety standards. Because when we set our safety standards, we were in some ways safer than European trains. But over the last several decades, European trains are actually much safer than American trains, but we're stuck in that old regulatory regime. And so our trains are more expensive to operate, they're not as safe, and they're more expensive to buy because you can't just buy them off the shelf, right? The Obama administration had new rules that they were promulgating for allowing us to buy those new style trains, and the Trump administration put that on hold. That rulemaking process is not moving forward. And there's little things like that that are very frustrating, that are not moving forward in the way we want. So we've got that challenge with the signaling system. So this is not a signaling system that's been in use anywhere else in the world. So there isn't a regulatory regime for getting it tested that takes less than a year or two for faster than 90 miles an hour. It's very interesting. We have very specific regulations for going 90 miles an hour, nothing above. And again, the Obama administration was working on regulations for going faster than 90 miles an hour. The Trump administration isn't. And so that's why it will be a little while till the trains are going 110, but hopefully they will be going 90 miles an hour this year.
Question?
Yes.
Clarify the relationship between what you're proposing and Amtrak. Are you putting them out of business? Do you work parallel? What is that? And are you an agency? How are you funded, your organization?
I'm sorry that I skipped that very important step. So I work for the Midwest High Speed Rail Association is a 501c C3 nonprofit. Most of our donors are individuals like yourselves, people who really want to be able to take the train or they want their town to be better because there are trains. About a little bit of our funding right now comes from a few corporations, not as much as it should. And then there's a couple of foundations who the directors of those foundations are individuals who really want high-speed trains. And in fact, one of them has been very clear over the last 5 years, I want you to get a high-speed train and a high-speed train, not 110. So that's who we are. And we don't care who the operator is, right? What we want to do is have the state and the feds and local entities, because everybody's got a piece of this, to say we're going to make this happen. And we want to connect all of the people who want to make it happen and find a way to make it happen. Amtrak has some special powers that other railroads have special powers that normal corporations don't. So you have to have a railroad actually to operate trains. But Amtrak then has powers that railroads don't have that you have to have in order to cross state lines. So Amtrak plays an incredibly important role in this, but it doesn't have to be Amtrak for everything. And in fact, I would argue that if we restructured the Northeast Illinois Passenger Rail Corporation, which is one of the two operating entities of Metra, to be a statewide railroad, we would be better off because it would be a locally controlled state government-owned railroad. But it doesn't matter.
He mentioned 3rd Street to 10th Street.
Yes.
Is that going to happen? And why are we spending so much money to improve 3rd Street if it's not going to be used in the near future?
So I assume that it is going to happen. A couple of visits ago, I walked over and looked at your new underpass, actually walked under it, took pictures of it over, and I'm sorry I forgot what street, that Carpenter, and Ash Street is underway, right? So, and I know that your city government is working as hard as they can to make it happen. One of these things that you need to do is keep making the service better. And there were some pretty serious challenges here in Springfield with the safety of the tracks and with the speed coming through town. So, you know, I don't know how long it's going to take. I'm thrilled that people are continuing to invest in the service, and I really like looking at those safer grade crossings as they come through town. So I don't know.
Shut down eventually?
You know, I'm going to say again, I know that your city government is working on it. I don't know when it's going to happen. So we believe that the high-speed train would come down 10th Street. Yes.
What money has been spent so far on the upgrades from St. Louis to Chicago, wrought iron fencing, a couple of stations that have been totally remodeled?
Yeah, so it's just under the cost of the Sears Tower in the last time that the Sears Tower changed hands. It was about $1.9 billion.
We went after it.
Yes.
I'm assuming we have that too, which is quite a lot of money.
So, well, it's not quite a lot of money. It's a little bit of money. And when you consider that you couldn't replace a mile of I-55 if you had to do it from scratch for less than $2 billion.
No, I'm aware of that. I worked for IDOT. I surveyed all 3 corridors for the crosstown expressways in Chicago, which of course never came to pass. When the Eisenhower was built, it was $1 million a mile. and today it's, outrageous, as you said. So I'm just kind of wondering, I just rode the train 2 weeks ago, and you rode it yesterday. The section of track from Joliet to Chicago is like a carnival ride. I mean, really. You have to hold on because you will be flown right down to the ground if you don't hold on to something. So
Actually,
I'm wondering what rail was fixed.
so from Joliet, so from the north end of the Joliet station to WR Tower, which is across the river from St. Louis, completely replaced from the ground up. Now, I will say that on the return trip this week, I commented on they've done some really significant track work between Joliet and Chicago, and it used to be that you would rock your way out of there in 10 miles an hour and stopping here, and it was nice, when you think about what everybody else in the world is doing, and to be excited about going 30 miles an hour consistently for 5 miles is a big step, but it is a big step forward. Brighton Park, the junction at Brighton Park was a huge improvement. The fix at Joliet, there's been a bunch of stuff happen there. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done north of Joliet, and the proof of that is we got delayed. We were sitting at Archer and Ashland for 10, 15 minutes because there was something happening at the junction over at 21st Street. But part of this is actually building that access to Chicago. You've got to figure out how to get more than just the Chicago to St. Louis trains on it in order to pay, because that's really where the expense is. And that's why you've got to look at this funnel effect in order to find a lot of trains going into Chicago. Yes?
Are any of the carriers members of your association?
I'm trying to remember, because they used to be, and they fell off, and I'm trying to go back to them. But I don't think I've got any back on board yet.
Okay, one more question. All the way in the back.
Thank you for being here with us today. Quick question, or I guess a comment, trying to think about where we are today in the next 25, 40 years. You had talked about, picked up on the comment about the kind of a statewide railroad with that corridor up north. And just listening and thinking about this, has there been thought about, you mentioned PPP a couple times as well, about going statewide, because this is going to be a statewide system eventually, or hopefully as planned, about going statewide, doing a statewide taxing authority with the railroad, and because you're going to need some type of geo bonding in addition to revenue bonding to do the infrastructure, in addition to federal grants and monies that may be coming from Washington, but also looking at dissolving Amtrak in the state and actually taking the federal subsidies from Amtrak with the statewide taxing authority, so you can offer that up as a package to a PPP for, hey, we have bonding, we have revenue bonding, we have geo bonding, we have the federal subsidies from Amtrak that we can do the statewide. I just wonder, just that concept, sitting here thinking and listening, has there been plans or thoughts like that down the road as far as how we get to the point of building this system and managing and operating it? Because I know that there was some discussion, there may have been legislation introduced a few years ago about tapping into other local taxing bodies that have bonding authority to subsidize buses and connections and train stations and things like that. So that's a small piece to it, but looking at an overall system, you almost need to have a taxing authority with bonding ability, and to be able to offer up a nice package for PPP, especially with an endeavor such as this, is so visionary and futuristic. You're going to have to put a very large carrot on the table, I would imagine.
Yes. Now, coming back to the question about the carriers. Today with Amtrak, the Amtrak demands the highest quality service and pays significantly less per train mile than freight does. So it's not something, the railroads are not thrilled about adding passenger trains under the current deal. So one of the things we're advocating very strongly for is a new deal where the railroads see it as a business and therefore they invest their own money, which is not to say that just like highways require hidden subsidies from lots of different places, trains are going to require some direct investment by the state. But we believe that if you paid the railroad more, you could actually get a lot more people on the train paying higher fares, so actually the cost per unit goes down. And we could get more riders with the same amount of money that we're paying today. The railroads weren't very happy with some of the processes that happened with setting the rules up for spending the money that's out here. Union Pacific got a very good deal, but some of the other railroads didn't like it, so that's why they dropped off of our membership. So part of the puzzle is, how do we make the railroads happy about this so they get on our side? Another part is, how do you make these interesting financing packages work? And that's what we need to get to, is these ideas about how do you create, and in California what they did was they passed a bond issue with a majority vote of the voters, and the bond issue is $10 billion, and again with messaging is kind of challenging. It wasn't just for high-speed rail. All of the connecting services got a piece of that as well. They also created, they raised a tax to increase highway spending and transit spending. So again, in this coordinated plan, in LA, they're going to take their kind of not so good commuter rail service, and they're going to make it into a service that's very much like what they have in Europe. So that's a piece of it. Private investment clearly is a clear piece, but you can't get to these solutions if you don't have the framework. And the framework is a ridership model that looks at the entire state and actually beyond as a network, and then looks at a way to phase it, and looks at a way that the entire state benefits from the initial investments. So yes, we need to start looking at that. So thank you very much.
Please help me thank Rick for being with us today. Thank you very, very much.
Yep.